Our second presenter is Professor Pauline Mcgurk. Pauline is one of those rare Irish citizens who have migrated to Australia for reasons other than economic or judicial necessity. Her Irishness prompted me to take another book from my population section down, and it's called The Population of Ireland 1750 to 1845. And the introduction to the book quotes from an 1825 letter from somebody not particularly known to me. But this person was trying to explain the inaccuracy of the population counts in Ireland at the time. The letter says, the Catholics are to blame. It says, quote, they are ever unwilling to make known their numbers to any agent of government. They fear being banished to some bog or desert if they are found to be too numerous, rather than believing that measures might be adopted for the purposes of improving their condition. So Pauline is Professor of Human Geography and Director of the Centre for Urban and Regional Studies at the University of Newcastle. Her research interests are in urban political geography, and she specialises in urban governance. In her work, Pauline has documented and explained very early on the emergence of Sydney as a global city region. Currently, she's working again in and around Sydney on the growth of master-planned residential estates. And in new research is investigating the importance of urban actors and urban initiatives in the governance of carbon. Pauline's most recent population work is with a colleague from the University of New England, Neil Argent, and it's featured in another special edition I'll show you later of our journal, Geographical Research, and I suspect that Pauline will speak a little bit to material in that piece of research. Like all our panellists here tonight, Pauline has made significant national and state government policy contributions, a lot of collaborative work with state government agencies and across a number of universities. I think it's fair to say Pauline is one of Australia's genuine international scholars, and her fellowships at esteemed institutions like Trinity College in Dublin, her home university, but also at the universities of Glasgow, Durham, Bristol, and most recently the University of British Columbia show the esteem in which she is held. So please welcome Pauline Mcgurk.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks everyone for coming along this evening. Okay, so Australia, as I'm sure you know, has long had a very distinctive population distribution pattern. 3/4 of us live in cities with over 100,000 people in them. The largest 18 of those cities are mapped on the top map here, and their recent growth is graphed on the right. 2/3 of us live in the capital cities, and 85% of us live within 50 kilometres of the coast, leaving us with these very low distributions of population in the inland, which you'll see on the second map here. Now, this distribution has presented a suite of social, economic and environmental challenges for Australia's cities and regions. In 2010, population projections from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, and Federal Treasury in the intergenerational report that Glenn mentioned, projected that Australia's population would increase very significantly to 36 million by 2050. That's a 65% growth on where we are right now. Population growth on this scale could potentially intensify all of those challenges I mentioned. But as ever, in whether these challenges are realised, the geography of this population growth is critical. The distribution of where people settle, where they live, in what numbers and in what kinds of compositions. And of course, how we anticipate and respond to this in terms of management, in terms of public policy, is going to be fundamental to how Australia fares. So tonight, I'm going to talk about population growth, the kinds of places where growth is likely to be concentrated, and its implications, especially in terms of equity and environment. And an important point that I want to argue is that in shaping Australia's well-being with a larger population, the provision of infrastructure is going to be a determining factor. Now, that's not an unusual claim. There's been a lot of talk about infrastructure in recent years. But the point I particularly want to make is that what's going to be really important is the provision of infrastructure that's sensitive to the geography of population growth. And that doesn't just mean ensuring infrastructure provision in growth areas. And I'll show in a moment that lots of the growth areas are likely to be in and around the big cities. But it also means addressing differential infrastructural needs within urban areas so that we manage growth effectively. Infrastructure is one of the most effective growth management tools that we have. So we need to be able to use it to support and drive the sorts of changes we need to live sustainably and equitably in larger cities. So to begin with, I want to address the patterns, the distribution of population growth that we're likely to see. Now, as Glenn said, forecasting populations is a tricky business, especially if you want to go beyond about 10 or 15 years, because things change. So 36 million by 2050 may or may not be quite where we end up, but we can be more sure of at least 3 trends. First, that the population will grow. Second, that overseas migration is likely to continue to be an important driver of growth. Immigration's driven about 50 to 60% of national growth in recent decades, shown on the blue part of the graph here. And that's likely to persist given strong labour demand and population ageing. But as Glenn said, policy is a huge part of how that proceeds. And the third thing we can be a little more sure of is that the bulk of population expansion will be captured by the big cities, and particularly the capital cities. In recent years, 4/5 of all of Australia's growth has been in the major cities, 2/3 of it in the capital cities. And in part, at least, that is connected to immigration. In the past 15 to 20 years, about 90% of immigrants, people like myself, have settled in the major cities. So if ABS projections are realised, nearly 3/4 of predicted growth to 2050 will go to the capital cities. So that's an additional 10 million people. As you'll see here, this would place Sydney and Melbourne at roughly 7 million, Brisbane at almost 4 million, Perth at just over 3.3 million, and Adelaide growing more slowly at 1.6 million. But beyond this, there are 3 new settlement dynamics connected to growth that are worth pointing to at this point. The first is the emergence of significant peri-urban zones of mixed urban and rural land uses on the outer fringes of our big cities, about 100 kilometres or so from the centres of those cities. Areas like the southwestern fringe of Sydney, which you can see here, are attracting population based on a growing preference for semi-rural situations and transport and communications that makes it possible for people to be connected to an urban economy, but still able to live in a semi-rural context. A second dynamic is the emergence of growth centres in high amenity areas, especially in the coastal zones of the east, the southeast, and the southwest of the country. So this is building on the sea change, tree change settlements that we've been hearing about for a while now. The graph on the left shows the fast-growing sea change locations in New South Wales over the last decade. Places like Port Macquarie, Byron, Shell Harbour, with 10 to 20% growth rates. And on the map, the dark blue and the dark brown highlight the trend in Western Australia, running south from Perth, and particularly right up the east coast through Queensland. Substantial flows of retirees and young families are likely to drive further growth in these areas, perhaps especially as the baby boomer retirement blitz takes hold, as it will increasingly. So these peri-urban and high amenity coastal areas are likely to be growth spots, and together they're projected to have the fastest rates of growth outside the capitals. The third settlement dynamic I wanted to mention is the emergence of extensive metropolitan regions. These are formed by the combination of the large cities growing outwards, the peri-urban developments on their fringes, and the deepening links between these large cities and second-tier cities in their surrounding regions. So the slide illustrates one of these, a mega metro region from the Sunshine Coast through Brisbane and south to the Gold Coast Tweed's Head. And we can think about 3 others. We can think about Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong as one of these, Geelong, Melbourne, Mornington Peninsula, and Wanneroo, Perth, Mandurah. These 4 areas have all been adding population at well above the national average, so we're likely to see some continued growth there. Okay, so see, these are the general patterns in the distribution of growth that we might expect to continue. So bigger cities capturing most of the growth and some new kinds of growth areas. For rural and regional areas, there are likely to be differential outcomes, gentle growth, stability, or decline, chiefly based on amenity and level of accessibility. But I'm not going to go into this this evening, because in the time I have, I want to talk about the areas that are likely to grow the most, and that is the large cities, and deal with the implications of this. Because for the large cities, the implications are largely about how we manage growth. Australia is, as you all know, a nation of cities. The successful functioning of the major cities is absolutely fundamental to Australia's future in economic terms, in social terms, in terms of environment, and in terms of sustainability. Now, bigger cities are not of themselves inherently problematic, but better managing cities and the patterns of mobility and consumption that they drive as they become bigger and more complex is going to need some fundamental transformations in urban spatial structure, and particularly in the ways we support this through infrastructural provision. So to break this down a bit, I want to talk about two major management challenges for larger cities. The first is economic productivity and ensuring equitable access to jobs across the city. So I'll deal with those together. And the second is equitable access to housing. And I want to talk about how important geographically appropriate infrastructure provision will be to each of these. Urban population growth is going to require very substantial additional job generation. Over the next 30 years or so, the metropolitan plans for the capital cities suggest that Sydney's going to need an additional 760,000 jobs, that Perth's going to need an additional 350,000 jobs, and that Adelaide will need an additional 280,000 jobs. Yet we know that the productivity of Australia's major cities has been declining, so the ability to generate jobs growth is waning somewhat. This has a lot to do with growing congestion costs that are related to very significant backlogs in economic infrastructure, roads, rail, freight, utilities, investment, and so on. Federal government calculations price this backlog currently at $300 billion. Population growth without infrastructural investment will see this double to more than $750 billion. And these backlogs particularly affect the larger cities. The slide here summarizes federal government estimates of the rising social costs of urban congestion for the capital cities to 2025. So addressing this is going to be crucial to the capacity of the big cities to generate additional employment. But just generating more jobs is not the whole story. Big cities have complex employment and labour markets. In Australian cities, using the Melbourne example here, employment is very dispersed and it's differentiated. Different kinds of employment is distributed very differently across the cities. So in the map on the right, you'll see that the royal blue is where the dominant form of employment is retail. The green is manufacturing. The orange is property and business services. And the match between the location of particular types of jobs and the residential location of the workforce is often far from ideal. It's what we call a spatial structural imbalance. And it produces very complex patterns of commuting flows across urban regions. In the graph here, you'll see the diversity of flows of commuting for Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth. Yeah. So you'll see there's inward commuting, there's outward commuting, there's commuting across suburbs, there's commuting between local government areas. And this creates really high levels of car dependency, especially in commuting. 77% of all journeys to work in Melbourne are made by private car, 85% if you go to the city's edges. For Sydney, it's 70%, and if you're outside the inner areas, it rises to 80%. In this context, some localities that don't have good access to transport get marginalised from access to job opportunities, and they certainly get marginalised from access to a diversity of job opportunities. And this is especially true of cities' outer fringes, which is where much population growth is focused and is likely to be focused going forward. The 24 fastest growing local government areas in Australia are on the fringes of the major cities, which is where, as you'll see here, growth has been concentrated over the last decades. 25% of all of Australia's metropolitan population lives in these outer fringe areas, 3.3 million people. And that's tipped to grow to 4.5 million by 2021. And that's often happening in advance of developing access to job opportunities. Getting to grips with the spatial structural imbalance I'm talking about, providing equitable access to the kinds of infrastructure that make a diversity of job opportunities accessible to workers, is going to be critical. And this is not just about transport and economic infrastructure. It's about social infrastructure, that is education and training, childcare, health and community services, the infrastructure that also determines people's ability to access employment opportunity. So this is going to be a fundamental growth management issue for a bigger urban Australia. And it's going to take the sorts of spatial infrastructure planning and implementation that Australian cities have struggled with so far. The next challenge I want to deal with is the question of housing. Urban population growth is going to produce big increases in urban housing demand. And that's not just because the urban population will grow, but also because the composition of households is going to change. It's going to get smaller. On the graph here, you'll see the two dark grey, the two shades of grey, one dark, one paler, show couple families without children and lone person households as the two types of household likely to become very dominant. So the number of households is growing more rapidly than the growth in population overall. That's been the case for some time now. And in the next 25 years, the number of households is expected to increase by 4 million, each household needing a dwelling. Access to housing is already pressured in Australian cities. I'm unlikely to need to tell anyone in this room that. National Housing Supply Council figures suggest that we currently have a national shortfall of 187,000 dwellings. And by 2030, without change, this is likely to reach 640,000. And shortfalls like this affect cities the most, where demand is highest and where high land and construction cost have pushed housing in accessible locations well beyond the affordable reach of moderate to low-income people. So again, there's a geography to this that's really important. These are the predictions that are in the current metropolitan strategies around Australia for expected increased dwelling demand. And to respond to this, all of these metropolitan strategies aim to address housing supply and affordability. They have land release programs to streamline housing supply. They're embedding affordable housing requirements in new developments. And they're encouraging the supply of more diverse housing stock to track with smaller households. And that's great. But wider fiscal policy, and again, infrastructure planning and investment, is going to be crucial in addressing rising housing demand effectively and equitably. Infrastructure enhances amenity and locational advantages wherever it is. That makes areas more attractive to potential buyers and therefore to developers, so it can lubricate housing supply in particular localities. It can support development at higher densities. That can create higher development value that in turn can allow councils greater latitude to require developers to boost affordable housing provision. So managing the housing question is going to be one of the most complex challenges to be tackled as Australia's cities grow bigger. And it's going to be crucial to address this rising demand and to break the nexus between affordable housing and marginalised underserviced locations. Strategic and geographically sensitive investments in economic and social infrastructure can be really effective in leveraging housing supply and affordability, just as it can be effective in reshaping the distribution of and the accessibility to job opportunities. So how we manage infrastructure will in many ways define the success or failure of urban growth management for a bigger urban Australia. Now, I'm aware I haven't mentioned environment yet, and of course, environmental and resource constraint is interwoven into all aspects of population growth and urban population growth. So I'll turn to this just before I finish. The spatial structure of Australia's cities was shaped in an era of cheap fuel, energy, and land, and of relatively plentiful water. So high resource consumption and high emissions lifestyles tend to be embedded into the way our urban land use is organised. It's embedded in our housing mix and in our transit systems. And sharpening resource constraints, particularly around energy and water, is going to really challenge this. So as our cities grow further, it's imperative that they grow within a framework of sustainable urbanism. Because as Peter Newton put it, the challenge of achieving sustainable development might be won or lost in urban Australia. But of course, achieving sustainable urbanism while accommodating population growth is going to demand substantive change and require a combination of new infrastructural technologies, changes in urban spatial structure, and change values and behaviour around consumption. So to touch briefly on one aspect of this before I conclude, I want to talk briefly about the relationship between urban population growth, water demand, and infrastructure investment. All of Australia's major cities are located in areas that are having climate change-induced reductions in rainfall, and further reductions are expected. But we've already reduced water consumption through restrictions and voluntary conservation measures around recent drought. And predictions show that per capita water use, that is per person, will remain stable or marginally decline. So it seems inevitable then that the growth of urban population will bring a growth in demand for water. The Water Services Association of Australia has forecast a 76% increase in water demand by 2056, accounting for that projected population growth. So there'll be substantially greater environmental pressure on urban water supply. And this is not sustainable without significant infrastructural, morphological, and behavioural change. So when it comes to infrastructure, to deal with the increased water demand of larger urban populations, cities are going to have to invest seriously in decentralised systems of water supply, in a wider range of water supply sources like stormwater harvesting, domestic harvesting, stormwater use, and water recycling for potable as well as non-potable uses. And this can be very confronting to public values and perception. So securing water for bigger urban populations sustainably is going to involve the political negotiation of contested values and some relatively tough choices ahead. And to return to my infrastructure point again, it's going to need substantial infrastructural transformations and investment. So this returns me to my key message about the implications of population growth, its concentration in big cities, and its implications, especially for growth management. Substantive and carefully planned investment in infrastructure is perhaps the most important management tool we have, and that's going to be what will shape the success or otherwise of urban population growth. Federal and state governments seem to have recognised this and to be prioritising integrated infrastructure and spatial planning in a way that we would probably all agree is long overdue. And in the context of inevitable urban population growth, how this issue is handled, to no small extent, will define Australia's future economic prosperity, our social and spatial equity, and our sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pauline. And as a little advertisement, there's a recent edition of the Institute of Australian Geographers Journal, Geographical Research, Volume 49, Number 3, and much of the material from Pauline's address can be found in that journal issue, and as you would guess, that's easily accessed and downloadable from the web. So thanks very much, Pauline.